Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Salem, Massachusetts. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you are watching from and the exact time at which you are listening to this narration. We are interested to know in which places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the spring of 1897, a fire marshal conducting routine inspections of municipal archives in Salem discovered something peculiar. An entire section of property records for a substantial residence at 47 Marlborough Street was missing, spanning the years 1889 through 1896. The gaps were clean, as though someone had deliberately removed the documents from their bindings. This discovery might have remained a minor bureaucratic curiosity had it not coincided with a catastrophic fire that occurred on March 3, 1897 at that very same address. When first responders arrived at the three-story Victorian residence in the pre-dawn hours, they expected a routine structure fire. What they discovered instead would lead to one of the most extensive criminal investigations in Massachusetts history and prompt authorities to systematically erase nearly all official records of what had transpired within those walls. The property had been home to an establishment known as Mortimer House for Respectable Young Women, operated by two sisters, Adelaide and Constance Mortimer. For nearly 8 years, the sisters had maintained an impeccable reputation in Salem society, providing lodging for young working women and students who needed safe, affordable housing. The house was substantial, with distinctive attic windows visible from the street, and had been considered a respectable institution by community standards. Adelaide, age 42 inches 1,897, handled the business affairs and maintained relationships with local merchants and civic leaders. Her younger sister, Constance, age 38, managed the daily operations and was known for her gentle manner with the residents. Together, they had built what appeared to be a successful and valued community service. When Fire Chief Walter Drummond and his brigade forced entry into the burning structure that March morning, they found the ground floor largely untouched by flames. The fire had originated in the attic and was spreading downward through the interior walls. Adelaide Mortimer was discovered unconscious in a second-floor bedroom, overcome by smoke. As firefighters worked to control the blaze, Chief Drummond made the decision to access the attic despite concerns about structural integrity. What he found there caused him to immediately halt firefighting operations and summon the Salem Police Department. Within hours, the property was declared a crime scene. By afternoon, detectives had begun sealing evidence, and by evening, orders came from the highest levels of state government to restrict all information about the discoveries. The official explanation released to newspapers was deliberately vague, mentioning only that irregularities had been found and investigations were ongoing. Whispered rumors began circulating immediately through Salem, but those rumors would never be confirmed publicly. Within months, nearly every official record pertaining to the Mortimer sisters and their establishment would be removed from public access, sealed by court order, or simply disappear from archives. The Mortimer sisters arrived in Salem on a crisp October afternoon in 1889, presenting themselves as recently bereaved siblings from Philadelphia seeking a fresh start following the death of their elderly parents. According to the story they told to landlords, merchants, and eventually their neighbors, they had inherited a modest sum that would allow them to purchase property and establish a respectable business. Their credentials appeared impeccable, supported by letters of reference from Philadelphia civic leaders and church officials that praised their character and business acumen. The sisters moved quickly to establish themselves in Salem society. Within weeks of their arrival, they had purchased the substantial three-story residence at 47 Marlborough Street for what property records indicated was a fair market price paid in cash. The building was well suited to their stated purpose of operating a lodging house for young women. Built in the Victorian style common to the area, it featured numerous bedrooms on the second and third floors, spacious common areas on the ground level, and a prominent attic space with distinctive gabled windows facing the street. The structure was sound, the neighborhood respectable, and the location convenient to the shops and businesses where potential lodgers might find employment. Adelaide and Constance moved into the residence in November 1889 and immediately began preparations to receive lodgers. They furnished the bedrooms modestly but adequately, established house rules that emphasized propriety and Christian values, and placed carefully worded advertisements in the Salem Evening News announcing the opening of Mortimer House for respectable young women. The advertisements emphasized safety, cleanliness, reasonable rates, and the sisters' commitment to providing a proper environment for working women and students. Initial reception from Salem society was cautiously positive. The sisters attended services at First Church, where they presented themselves as devout women committed to serving their community. Adelaide, the elder sister, took the lead in social interactions, speaking confidently about their plans and handling business matters with competence. Constance appeared quieter, more reserved, but neighbors noted her gentle manner and apparent dedication to charitable work. Their references from Philadelphia withstood scrutiny from those who bothered to investigate them, lending credibility to their story. The first lodgers began arriving in December 1889. The women who sought rooms at Mortimer House represented the types of young women increasingly common in American cities during this era. They were shopgirls earning modest wages at Salem's department stores, teachers working at local schools, nurses in training at Salem Hospital, and young women who had aged out of orphanages and needed affordable housing. The sisters charged rates that were competitive with other lodging houses but offered amenities that made Mortimer House attractive. Meals were included, the rooms were clean and adequately heated, and the sisters maintained what appeared to be genuine concern for their lodgers' welfare. By early 1890, Mortimer House had reached near capacity with approximately 15 young women in residence at any given time. During its first 2 years of operation, Mortimer House established itself as a valued institution within Salem's community. The lodging house filled a genuine need in a city where young working women had limited options for safe, affordable housing. Unlike many boarding houses of the era, which could be poorly maintained or operated by landlords of questionable character, Mortimer House gained a reputation for cleanliness, order, and the sisters' evident commitment to their residents' welfare. Adelaide managed the business aspects with impressive efficiency, maintaining detailed accounts, ensuring bills were paid promptly, and cultivating relationships with local merchants who supplied the household's needs. She presented herself as a shrewd businesswoman with high standards, and those who dealt with her found her exacting but fair. She negotiated favorable rates for bulk purchases, managed the household budget carefully, and ensured that the property was properly maintained. Her stern demeanor commanded respect, and few questioned her authority once she had established herself in the community. Constance handled the daily operations with a gentler touch that complemented her sister's firmness. She supervised meal preparations, attended to residents who fell ill, mediated minor disputes among lodgers, and created what appeared to be a genuinely caring environment. Former residents from this early period who provided statements years later remembered Constance as kind, attentive to their needs, and sincerely interested in their well-being. She would sit with homesick young women, offer advice about navigating employment challenges, and ensure that even the poorest residents had adequate clothing and necessities. The sisters became regular attendees at First Church, sitting in the same pew each Sunday with several of their residents accompanying them. Reverend Samuel Morrison welcomed their participation in church activities and noted in church bulletins their generous donations to charitable causes. Adelaide and Constance both joined the Ladies' Aid Society and contributed to efforts supporting Salem's poor and orphaned children. Their public piety seemed sincere, reinforcing their reputation as women of strong moral character committed to Christian service. Testimonials preserved in church records and personal letters from this period paint a consistently positive picture. Parents of young women residing at Mortimer House wrote grateful letters, praising the sisters for providing safe lodging and moral guidance. Employers whose workers lived at the house noted that the women were well-rested, properly fed, and punctual, suggesting the household ran efficiently. Former residents who moved on to marriage or other circumstances wrote fondly of their time under the sisters' care, describing the house as a place where they felt secure during a vulnerable period of their lives. The sisters made a particular point of taking in what they called charity cases, young women who could not afford even the modest rates charged to regular lodgers. These were often orphans who had aged out of institutional care, young women who had lost employment and had nowhere to turn, or those recovering from illnesses. Adelaide and Constance would house these women for reduced rates or sometimes no payment at all, asking only that they contribute to household tasks. This charitable work enhanced their reputation considerably. By 1891, an observable pattern had emerged at Mortimer House, though it initially attracted little attention. The establishment experienced unusually high turnover among its residents, with young women frequently departing without providing forwarding addresses or maintaining contact with acquaintances they had made during their stay. In the context of the era, when young women often moved between cities seeking better employment or returning to families, such transience seemed unremarkable. The sisters consistently explained departures the same way. Restless young women had found opportunities elsewhere, had married and moved away, or had reconciled with families and returned home. The first case that drew any scrutiny involved Margaret Hollis, a 19-year-old shopgirl who had been residing at Mortimer House since February 1891. Margaret worked at a millinery shop on Washington Street and, by all accounts, was a reliable employee who gave no indication of planning to leave Salem. In April 1891, she failed to appear for work one morning. When her employer inquired at Mortimer House, Adelaide explained that Margaret had left suddenly the previous evening, mentioning something about a family emergency in Vermont. Margaret never returned to collect her final wages. In May 1891, Margaret's brother arrived in Salem from Boston, seeking information about his sister. He had received no communication from her, despite their close relationship. He filed a missing persons report with Salem police, providing a description of his sister and the circumstances of her disappearance. The investigation was perfunctory, consisting mainly of a visit to Mortimer House, where Adelaide repeated her account of Margaret's sudden departure. With no evidence of foul play and given Margaret's legal status as an adult free to travel, police closed the case. Similar disappearances accumulated over the following months. Sarah Dunmore, a teacher's assistant, vanished in June 1891. Emma Crawford, a seamstress, disappeared in September 1891. Ruth Prescott, a nurse in training, was last seen at Mortimer House in November 1891. In each case, the sisters provided explanations consistent with voluntary departure. Sarah had mentioned dissatisfaction with her position and spoke of opportunities in New York. Emma had seemed troubled and talked about returning to her family in Pennsylvania. Ruth had been courting a merchant sailor and supposedly left to join him. Families placed classified advertisements in newspapers seeking information about missing daughters, but responses were rare and never led to finding the young women. Salem police received occasional inquiries but found nothing to contradict the sisters' accounts. Cultural attitudes of the time made investigation difficult. Young women were increasingly mobile, seeking employment and independence in ways that troubled traditional social structures. It was not unusual for women to sever family ties, especially if relationships had been strained. The notion that respectable women operating a church-endorsed lodging house might be involved in disappearances seemed far less plausible than the explanation that restless young women had simply moved on. The community continued to trust Adelaide and Constance despite these occasional questions because the sisters had successfully positioned themselves as pillars of respectability. Julia Brennan resided at Mortimer House from March 1892 through February 1893, working as a clerk at a dry goods store on Essex Street. In a detailed statement provided to authorities in April 1897, following the fire and subsequent investigation, Julia described experiences during her time at the house that had troubled her, but which she had initially dismissed as explainable phenomena. Her account provided crucial insight into the atmospheric disturbances that several residents had noticed during this period. According to Julia's testimony, the disturbances began approximately 2 months after her arrival at Mortimer House. She occupied a third-floor bedroom directly below the attic space, which Adelaide had explained was used only for storage. The attic door, located at the end of the third-floor hallway, remained locked at all times, and the sisters maintained exclusive possession of the keys. On quiet nights, Julia began hearing sounds from above her room. She described them as intermittent scraping noises, as though furniture or heavy objects were being moved across the attic floor. Occasionally she heard what sounded like muffled thumping, rhythmic and persistent, lasting for several minutes before stopping abruptly. Most disturbing were the sounds she could only describe as crying or moaning, faint and indistinct, that seemed to come from the attic late at night when the rest of the house had settled into silence. Julia initially attributed these sounds to the kinds of noises old houses make, the settling of boards, wind moving through gaps in the structure, or perhaps rats in the attic space. However, the sounds became more frequent and more difficult to explain away as ordinary household phenomena. Other residents occupying third-floor rooms made similar observations during informal conversations, mentioning that the attic seemed unusually active for a simple storage space. After several weeks of disturbed sleep, Julia approached Adelaide to inquire about the nocturnal noises. Adelaide's response was delivered with her characteristic firmness. The house was old, Adelaide explained, and the attic boards were loose in places, causing them to creak and groan when temperature changes caused the wood to expand and contract. As for the other sounds, Adelaide suggested that rats had likely established nests in the attic, and she assured Julia that steps would be taken to address the problem. Adelaide's explanation seemed reasonable enough, and Julia tried to accept it. However, the sounds continued unabated, and the promised steps to address them never materialized. Other residents who mentioned the disturbances received similar explanations, always delivered matter-of-factly, and with a subtle implication that excessive concern about ordinary household sounds reflected poorly on one's composure. During this same period, the sisters instituted a new house rule requiring all residents to remain in their bedrooms after 9 o'clock in the evening unless using the washroom. This rule was presented as necessary for maintaining proper rest and ensuring that working women received adequate sleep. The sisters began installing additional locks on doors throughout the house, explaining this as a security measure to protect residents from potential intruders. Julia's statement included a particularly disturbing observation from late one night in November 1892. Unable to sleep due to sounds from above, she rose to use the washroom around midnight. As she stepped into the hallway, she observed Adelaide and Constance ascending the attic stairs, carrying what appeared to be heavy bundles wrapped in canvas between them. Thomas Whitfield operated a hardware store on Federal Street in Salem from 1885 until his retirement in 1910. In a statement provided to investigators in March 1897, Whitfield described unusual purchasing patterns he had observed from Adelaide Mortimer during the years she had been a customer at his establishment. While individual purchases had seemed unremarkable at the time, Whitfield acknowledged that when viewed collectively, they created a disturbing picture that only became apparent in retrospect. According to Whitfield's records, preserved in his business ledgers, Adelaide had been a regular customer beginning in late 1889. Her initial purchases were typical for someone managing a large household: nails, hinges, tools for minor repairs, and lamp oil. However, beginning in early 1891, her purchases took on a different character. She began buying significant quantities of quicklime, explaining to Whitfield that she was using it to improve the soil in her garden and to address drainage issues in the cellar. The quantities she purchased seemed excessive for these stated purposes, but Whitfield had no reason to question a customer's horticultural ambitions. She also purchased heavy canvas in bulk, numerous coils of rope of varying thicknesses, and an unusual number of padlocks and chains, explaining these items as necessary for securing stored goods in the attic and outbuildings. Whitfield's statement was corroborated by similar accounts from other Salem merchants. The proprietor of a general goods store reported that Adelaide regularly purchased large quantities of lye soap, far more than would be needed for normal household cleaning, even in an establishment the size of Mortimer House. Adelaide also purchased large tin containers with sealed lids, explaining that she used them for preserving foods and storing dry goods to protect them from vermin. The local apothecary, Martin Chambers, maintained detailed records of all pharmaceutical sales as required by law. His ledgers showed that Adelaide had made regular purchases of chloroform and laudanum throughout the early 1890s. When Chambers questioned the frequency of these purchases, Adelaide explained that several of her residents suffered from various ailments requiring sedation, and that she kept these medications on hand for their relief under guidance from a physician whose name she never specified. Chambers noted the purchases were always made in quantities that fell just below the threshold that would have required a physician's written authorization, suggesting Adelaide understood exactly how much she could purchase without arousing official scrutiny. Perhaps most telling were the shipping records maintained by the Railway Freight Office. A clerk who had worked at the station from 1890 through 1896 recalled that Adelaide arranged regular shipments of heavy trunks and crates from Salem to various rural destinations, primarily in western Massachusetts and upstate New York. These shipments always occurred during evening hours when the freight office was less busy, and Adelaide always paid in cash, never providing detailed information about the contents beyond vague descriptions of household goods or personal effects. The destinations varied, never the same location twice in succession, and the consignees were always listed with common names that subsequent investigation would reveal were likely fictitious. The change in Constance Mortimer's demeanor became noticeable to regular observers beginning in late 1893 and accelerated dramatically through 1894. Multiple sources documented her transformation from the gentle, composed woman who had first arrived in Salem to someone exhibiting clear signs of severe psychological distress. Church attendance records maintained by First Church showed that Constance, previously present at every Sunday service and most midweek prayer meetings, began missing services with increasing frequency starting in October 1893. When she did attend, parishioners noted her haggard appearance, her tendency to sit with her head bowed throughout the service, and her habit of leaving immediately after the final hymn rather than participating in social exchanges. Reverend Samuel Morrison recorded in his personal journal an incident from November 1893 when Constance had approached him after a Wednesday evening service requesting a private audience. Morrison brought her into his study, where Constance appeared to struggle with something she desperately wanted to confess. According to Morrison's account, she began speaking about terrible things happening at Mortimer House, but before she could provide specifics, she suddenly stopped mid-sentence, her face going pale. She apologized profusely, claimed she was not well, and fled from the church, despite Morrison's attempts to encourage her to continue. He noted that Adelaide had been waiting outside his study door when Constance emerged. Constance never attempted another private conversation with the Reverend, and Adelaide began accompanying her sister everywhere. Multiple Salem residents provided accounts of observing Constance's declining state. The wife of the grocer on Washington Street described an incident in January 1894 when Constance came to the store to purchase supplies. While selecting items, Constance suddenly began weeping uncontrollably, repeating that she could not continue, that she heard them calling to her, and that God would never forgive what they had done. The grocer's wife attempted to comfort her, but Constance fled the store without completing her purchases. When Adelaide appeared an hour later to apologize for her sister's behavior, she explained that Constance was suffering from female hysteria and was under a physician's care. However, no physician in Salem ever confirmed treating Constance. Residents of Mortimer House during this period observed the changing dynamic between the sisters. Where Adelaide and Constance had previously worked together, Adelaide increasingly took control of all operations. She began speaking for Constance in situations where Constance would previously have responded herself, and she kept her sister close, rarely allowing her to interact with lodgers without supervision. Late-night arguments between the sisters became audible to residents whose rooms were near theirs, though the specific words were difficult to discern through the walls. One particularly disturbing incident occurred during a communal dinner in March 1894. According to multiple witnesses, the meal was proceeding normally when Constance suddenly stood, knocking over her chair, and screamed that they were still up there and that she could hear them scratching at the walls. Adelaide rose immediately, gripped her sister's arm with visible force, and guided her from the dining room while speaking to her in low, firm tones. In September 1894, Fire Marshal Herbert Clayton issued a notice to all boarding houses in Salem requiring routine safety inspections to ensure compliance with new fire prevention ordinances. Mortimer House, as a licensed lodging establishment, was included in the inspection schedule with a date set for early October 1894. Adelaide Mortimer responded to the inspection notice with unusual resistance. She sent a written request to Marshal Clayton asking for a postponement, citing ongoing repairs that would make a thorough inspection difficult. When the rescheduled date arrived, she requested another delay, this time claiming that several residents were ill with influenza. After a third postponement request, Clayton indicated that no further delays would be granted and that the inspection would proceed on a specific date in late November 1894, or the establishment's operating license would be subject to review. The inspection finally occurred on November 28, 1894. Clayton's official report, filed with the city on December 3rd, noted several concerns about blocked exits and inadequate lighting in hallways, but concluded that the property met minimum safety standards. However, the report also included a notation that the inspector had been unable to complete a full inspection due to the property owner's claim that portions of the building, specifically the attic, were structurally unsafe and could not be accessed without risk of injury. Adelaide had explained that the attic floor had rotted in several places and that repairs were scheduled to begin shortly. Clayton had accepted this explanation and noted it in his official report. What the official report did not contain, but what was revealed when Clayton's private journal was discovered among his effects after his death in 1952, was his deep suspicion about the true state of affairs at Mortimer House. In journal entries dated November 28th and 29th, 1894, Clayton described his concerns in detail. He noted that Adelaide had appeared extremely anxious throughout the inspection, following him closely and repeatedly attempting to direct his attention away from the third-floor hallway where the attic access was located. When he insisted on at least viewing the attic door, he observed that it was secured with multiple heavy locks that seemed excessive for a simple storage area. Adelaide became agitated when he approached the door, insisting that the floor beyond was genuinely dangerous. Clayton noted an unusual odor on the third floor that he could not identify, something chemical mixed with what might have been decay, though Adelaide claimed it was from treatments applied to the rotting attic boards. Most disturbing to Clayton was his observation of Constance during the inspection. She had remained in a corner of the parlor throughout his visit, never speaking and appearing terrified. When Clayton attempted to greet her directly, she looked at him with what he described as desperate pleading in her eyes, as though she wanted to speak but could not. Adelaide quickly intervened, explaining that her sister was unwell and easily confused, gently but firmly guiding Constance from the room. Clayton wrote in his journal that he felt certain something was seriously wrong in the house, but lacked the legal authority to investigate beyond his mandate as fire marshal. He noted his intention to return for a follow-up inspection once the attic repairs were supposedly completed. However, this follow-up never occurred. Elizabeth Moore arrived at Mortimer House in September 1894, a 21-year-old woman from a prominent Boston family seeking independence before her planned marriage the following summer. Unlike many residents who came from humble backgrounds, Elizabeth was well-educated, financially secure, and maintained regular correspondence with her family. Her presence at the lodging house was somewhat unusual given her circumstances, but she had explained to her parents that she wished to experience life as a working woman before settling into marriage, and had taken a position teaching at a small private school in Salem. Elizabeth's letters home, carefully preserved by her mother and later provided to investigators, documented her impressions of Mortimer House with the insight of an educated observer. In her early letters, she described Adelaide as stern but fair, and Constance as kind, though increasingly withdrawn. She noted the comfortable accommodations and the respectable character of her fellow residents. By November, her letters began mentioning aspects of the house that troubled her. She wrote about sounds from the attic that disturbed her sleep, about Adelaide's increasingly controlling management style, and about Constance's obvious distress. In her final letter, dated December 18, 1894, Elizabeth wrote to her mother that she had become convinced something terrible was happening in the house and that she intended to investigate the locked attic when the opportunity arose. She mentioned having observed Adelaide and Constance carrying what appeared to be food and water up the attic stairs late one night. Elizabeth Moore disappeared in early January 1895. When she failed to send her promised letter, her father, Harrison Moore, a respected Boston attorney, traveled to Salem to check on his daughter. Adelaide informed him that Elizabeth had left Mortimer House on January 3rd with a young man she had been seeing secretly, providing no forwarding address and leaving most of her belongings behind. Adelaide claimed Elizabeth had seemed distressed in her final days at the house, suggesting she might have been suffering from a nervous condition. Harrison Moore found this explanation completely inconsistent with his knowledge of his daughter's character. Elizabeth was engaged to be married to a man her family knew well, and she maintained regular and honest communication with her parents. Moore demanded a thorough investigation, filing a missing persons report with Salem police and personally interviewing other residents of Mortimer House. His inquiries revealed that Elizabeth was not the only young woman to have disappeared from the establishment, and he began documenting a pattern of vanishings that should have prompted official concern years earlier. The formal police investigation that followed was conducted with more thoroughness than previous inquiries, but it ultimately reached the same conclusion. Without evidence of foul play, and with Adelaide maintaining that Elizabeth had left voluntarily, police determined there was no crime to investigate. Frustrated by the limitations of official investigation, Harrison Moore hired a private investigator named Samuel Crawford. Crawford's detailed report documented his findings from weeks of surveillance. He confirmed that multiple women had vanished from Mortimer House under similar circumstances, that Adelaide's purchasing patterns included items that could be used for restraint, and that neighbors had observed suspicious activities. However, even Crawford's investigation could not produce the concrete evidence needed to justify legal action. Following Harrison Moore's investigation into his daughter's disappearance and the circulation of his concerns through Salem's social networks, some neighbors of Mortimer House began paying closer attention to activities at the property. While most residents of Marlborough Street preferred to maintain the social convention of not interfering in neighbors' affairs, a few individuals began informally monitoring the comings and goings at number 47. Among the most observant were Gerald and Margaret Hutchins, who lived in the adjacent property, and the Caldwell family across the street. Gerald Hutchins, a clerk at a shipping company, maintained somewhat irregular hours that often found him arriving home late in the evening. In a statement provided to authorities in 1897, he described observing unusual activities at Mortimer House during these off hours. On multiple occasions throughout 1895, he had seen the sisters moving heavy objects from the house to a wagon in the rear yard, typically after midnight, when the street was dark and quiet. The objects appeared to be trunks or large crates, which the sisters would load themselves rather than hiring men to assist. Hutchins had thought this odd, but had assumed the sisters were simply frugal. Margaret Hutchins contributed her own observations about the sisters' practice of burning items in the backyard incinerator at unusual hours. Several times each month, often late at night, she had been awakened by the smell of smoke and had observed the glow of a fire in the Mortimers' yard. On one occasion, when the wind shifted, carrying the smoke directly toward the Hutchins property, Margaret had noticed an unpleasant odor mixed with the normal smell of burning wood and paper, something chemical and acrid. When she mentioned this to Adelaide during a chance encounter, Adelaide explained that she was disposing of soiled linens and bedding from residents who had been ill, burning them as a sanitary precaution. The Caldwell family, consisting of parents and 3 children, had lived across from Mortimer House since before the sisters' arrival. They provided collective testimony about changes they had observed over the years. They noted a pattern of deliveries to the house, particularly the arrival of large wooden crates that required 2 or 3 men to carry inside. These deliveries always occurred in the evening, and Adelaide would supervise closely, directing the workers and appearing anxious that the work be completed quickly. The Caldwells also described Adelaide's increasingly hostile response to anyone who appeared to be watching the house too closely. On several occasions when neighborhood children had played near the property, Adelaide had emerged to chase them away with unexpected vehemence. One of the most disturbing accounts came from the Caldwells' eldest son, Thomas, who had been 12 years old in 1895. Thomas had climbed a large oak tree in his family's yard one afternoon, reaching a height that provided a clear view into the attic windows of Mortimer House. What he claimed to have seen through those windows became the subject of family debate. According to Thomas's statement given years later, he had observed movement behind the attic windows, faces pressed against the glass that were too still, too pale, with eyes that seemed to stare without blinking. Among the most damning pieces of evidence discovered following the March 1897 fire was a small, leather-bound journal, found hidden beneath a loose floorboard in Constance Mortimer's bedroom. The journal, which appeared to have been deliberately concealed, provided a documentary record of activities at Mortimer House and offered insight into Constance's deteriorating mental state as she participated in increasingly horrific acts under Adelaide's direction. The journal measured approximately 6 inches by 4 inches, bound in brown leather that had been water-stained and worn from handling. Detective Inspector George Mansfield, who discovered it during the systematic search of the property, noted that it had been carefully hidden, suggesting Constance knew the danger it represented if found by Adelaide. The pages contained entries in Constance's handwriting, though the script changed dramatically over time, beginning with neat, controlled penmanship and deteriorating into barely legible scrawls. The earliest entries dated from late 1889 and documented the arrival of the first lodgers in straightforward fashion. Constance recorded names, arrival dates, and basic information about each woman, occupation, hometown, family connections, and financial arrangements. A typical entry from December 1889 read, Sarah Mitchell, age 22, from Boston. Works as shop assistant, pays $3 weekly. Quiet girl, writes to mother every Sunday. The tone and content began shifting in 1891, becoming less focused on practical details and more concerned with other characteristics. Constance began noting whether residents had close family connections, whether they received regular correspondence, whether they had formed friendships with other lodgers. An entry from March 1891 stated, Margaret Hollis, age 19, from Vermont. Shop girl, no family correspondence received in 6 weeks. Keeps to herself. Adelaide says, this one is suitable. The phrase suitable began appearing with increasing frequency, always in connection with Adelaide's assessment. By mid-1891, the journal entries had taken on an unmistakably sinister character. Constance recorded cryptic phrases that suggested the sisters were engaged in systematic selection and targeting of certain residents. An entry from July 1891 read, Mary Sullivan departed. Adelaide prepared the room, delivered to collection on Thursday. Another from September 1891 stated, Emma Crawford, proving difficult, refuses the tonic. Adelaide says, we must wait for better opportunity. The entries from 1892 and 1893 documented an escalating pattern while revealing Constance's growing psychological distress. The handwriting became shakier, the entries more fragmented. Constance began expressing doubt and fear, even as she recorded participating in the activities Adelaide directed. An entry from October 1892 read, Another one to the attic tonight. She fought harder than the others. Adelaide had to use more chloroform. I cannot look at their faces anymore. The journal documented the disappearance of Elizabeth Moore with particularly haunting detail. The entry dated January 2nd, 1895 read, The Moore girl discovered Adelaide on the attic stairs last night. Became hysterical, threatened to go to authorities. Adelaide acted swiftly, used the chloroform while I held her arms. She fought too hard. Adelaide was angry. Now she is with the others. The winter of 1896 through early 1897 marked a dramatic change in the operations and appearance of Mortimer House. The establishment that had once bustled with residents became increasingly dark and silent. Records from the Salem City Directory show that the number of lodgers dropped precipitously during this period, from the typical 12 to 15 residents down to only 3 or 4 by late 1896. The women who remained were described by neighbors as desperate cases, young women with absolutely nowhere else to turn. All departed within a 2-week period in February 1897, leaving Adelaide alone in the building. Neighbors noted the accelerating physical deterioration of the property. The yard, once neatly maintained, became overgrown with dead vegetation. Shutters hung loose on several windows. Snow was not cleared from walkways, and mail began accumulating in the box by the front door. The house took on an abandoned appearance despite clear evidence that Adelaide remained in residence. Lights were sometimes visible late at night, moving from room to room, but the building remained dark during normal evening hours when households typically showed signs of life. Despite the reduced number of occupants, neighbors reported that disturbing sounds from the property actually increased during this period. The Hutchins family described hearing sounds of activity from the attic at all hours. Margaret Hutchins stated that on several occasions she heard what sounded like someone crying out. The sounds abruptly cut short. Gerald Hutchins reported seeing Adelaide in the backyard late one winter night, burning items in the incinerator despite temperatures well below freezing. She appeared to be working frantically, feeding the fire with materials he could not identify. The postal carrier who served Marlborough Street noted that Adelaide had stopped retrieving her mail by December 1896. Letters and parcels accumulated until he was forced to return them to senders marked as unclaimed. Among the returned items were letters from several families inquiring about missing daughters. Delivery drivers for local merchants reported that Adelaide had instructed them in late 1896 to leave all supplies at the street rather than bringing them to the house. On the few occasions when drivers saw Adelaide, they described her appearance as dramatically changed. Where she had once presented herself as a stern but respectable businesswoman, she now appeared disheveled and wild-eyed, her hair uncombed, her clothing stained. One driver reported that Adelaide had stood in an upstairs window watching him unload supplies, speaking to herself in an animated fashion, though no one else was visible. Constance had not been seen by anyone outside the property since November 1896. The last confirmed sighting came from a neighbor who observed both sisters in the backyard, engaged in what appeared to be a heated argument. Adelaide was seen gripping Constance's arm forcefully, while Constance seemed to be pleading or crying. After this incident, only Adelaide was ever observed, leading to speculation among neighbors about Constance's fate. The final 3 lodgers who departed in February 1897 left suddenly and together, describing an atmosphere of terror during their final weeks at Mortimer House. The fire that would finally expose the horrors concealed within Mortimer House began in the early morning hours of March 3, 1897. Night watchman Samuel Pierce was conducting his regular patrol route through the Marlborough Street neighborhood at approximately 2:30 a.m. when he observed an orange glow emanating from the attic windows of number 47. Pierce immediately sounded the alarm, using the call box at the nearest corner to summon the Salem Fire Brigade. Within minutes, firefighters under the command of Chief Walter Drummond arrived to find flames visible through the attic windows and smoke beginning to seep from gaps in the roof structure. The fire appeared concentrated in the attic space, with lower floors not yet significantly involved. Chief Drummond's initial assessment suggested the blaze was still controllable if firefighters could gain quick access. However, all attempts to enter the building were frustrated by the discovery that every door was locked from the inside. Front door, rear door, and side entrance all proved secured with multiple locks. Firefighters were forced to break down the front door using axes, precious minutes lost while the fire above continued to spread. Once inside, firefighters found the ground floor largely untouched by smoke or flames. The second floor was similarly intact, though smoke was filtering down from above. As firefighters searched bedrooms for occupants, they discovered Adelaide Mortimer, unconscious in a rear bedroom, overcome by smoke inhalation. She was immediately carried from the building and turned over to medical personnel. Adelaide was unresponsive but alive, her condition serious but not immediately life-threatening. With Adelaide removed and no other occupants located on the lower floors, Chief Drummond made the tactical decision to access the attic directly to attack the fire at its source. The attic stairs were located at the end of the third-floor hallway, behind a door secured with multiple heavy locks. Firefighters forced this door open and began ascending the narrow staircase. What they encountered at the top would cause Drummond to immediately order a cessation of firefighting operations and evacuation of all personnel from the building. Drummond's official report, filed later that day, described the scene in clinical terms. The attic space had been extensively modified from its original configuration. Interior walls had been constructed, creating multiple small cells or compartments. Evidence of human habitation was immediately apparent, along with clear signs that people had been confined in these spaces against their will. The fire had originated in one corner and had already consumed a significant portion of the structure, but enough remained intact for Drummond to comprehend the full horror of what he was observing. His account described crude wooden cells constructed within the larger space, each barely large enough for a person to lie down. He observed restraints affixed to walls, soiled bedding, waste buckets, and unmistakable evidence of prolonged human suffering. Most disturbing were the remains of individuals who had perished in the fire, though Drummond noted that some human remains appeared to have predated the fire by considerable time. The chief's decision to halt firefighting operations and secure the scene was immediate and absolute. He ordered his men to evacuate, established a perimeter to prevent unauthorized access, and sent a runner to summon Detective Inspector George Mansfield. By the time Mansfield arrived, the fire had burned itself out, largely due to the contained nature of the attic space. The lower floors remained largely undamaged, preserving potential evidence. Drummond met Mansfield at the street and described what he had observed in terms that made clear this was now a criminal investigation of the highest magnitude. Detective Inspector George Mansfield entered the damaged attic on the afternoon of March 3, 1897, accompanied by a team of investigators, a medical examiner, and a photographer. The official police report filed the following day, portions of which remained sealed for 50 years, provided systematic documentation of one of the most disturbing crime scenes in Massachusetts history. The attic space measured approximately 40 feet by 25 feet, with a peaked ceiling that rose to about 10 feet at its highest point. The original open layout had been extensively modified through construction of interior partition walls that divided the space into separate cells. These partitions had been built using rough lumber and appeared to have been constructed over years, with some sections showing weathering while others appeared more recent. Each cell measured approximately 6 feet by 8 feet, large enough for a person to lie down, but too small to stand upright due to the sloped ceiling. The cells were accessed through narrow doors secured with heavy bolts on the exterior. Inside each cell, investigators documented evidence of human habitation under conditions of extreme deprivation. Soiled bedding, thin mattresses stuffed with straw, waste buckets that had not been emptied regularly, crude eating utensils, and personal items belonging to occupants. Several cells contained restraint devices, chains bolted to wall studs with manacles designed to secure wrists or ankles. Medical examiner Dr. William Bradford noted that the restraint systems showed evidence of prolonged use, with wear patterns on the chains and biological residue on the manacles consistent with extended periods of wear. The most disturbing discoveries were made as investigators systematically searched each cell and the common areas of the attic. Human remains were found in multiple locations, some victims of the recent fire but others clearly deceased long before. Dr. Bradford's preliminary examination identified at least 7 sets of remains in various states of decomposition. Some bodies appeared to have been concealed within false walls constructed between cells, while others were found in the cells themselves. The varying states of decomposition suggested deaths had occurred over an extended period, with the earliest victims having perished perhaps several years before discovery. Among the items recovered was a locked trunk containing photographic equipment and numerous daguerreotype images. The photographs showed young women in various poses and states of distress. Some images appeared to have been taken shortly after the women's arrival in captivity, showing them restrained but still alert. Other photographs depicted the same individuals in later stages of captivity, visibly deteriorated and emaciated. The systematic nature of this photographic documentation suggested Adelaide had been deliberately recording her captives, perhaps as trophies or as part of whatever twisted logic justified her actions. Investigators also recovered medical instruments, bottles of chloroform and laudanum, implements that appeared to have been used for crude surgical procedures, and extensive supplies of quicklime and lye soap. The purpose of these chemicals became horrifyingly clear as investigators realized they had been used to manage the smell of decay in the confined attic space and to aid in disposing of remains. Personal effects recovered from the attic provided the means to identify many victims. Clothing with laundry marks, jewelry with inscriptions, letters and photographs that victims had brought with them, all had been collected and stored by Adelaide. Some belongings had been carefully labeled with the victim's name and date of arrival. Adelaide Mortimer remained unconscious for 3 days following her removal from the burning house, her condition stabilized but precarious due to smoke inhalation and burns. By March 6, 1897, physicians determined she had recovered sufficiently to answer questions, and Detective Inspector Mansfield conducted the first formal interrogation at Salem Hospital, where Adelaide remained under police guard. Mansfield's detailed transcripts, sealed by court order but later recovered, revealed a woman who seemed emotionally detached from the enormity of her crimes, yet paradoxically eager to explain her actions. Initially, Adelaide refused all questions, staring silently at the wall and declining even to acknowledge Mansfield's presence. This silence continued for 2 days of attempted interrogation. Then, on March 8th, Adelaide suddenly began speaking without prompting, interrupting Mansfield's routine questions with a statement that she was ready to explain everything so that people would understand the important work she and Constance had been doing. What followed was a rambling but disturbingly coherent account delivered in a matter-of-fact tone that suggested Adelaide genuinely believed she had been engaged in righteous work rather than systematic torture and murder. According to Adelaide's account, she and Constance had arrived in Salem with the explicit purpose of establishing an institution where they could save fallen women from lives of sin and degradation. Adelaide explained that they had observed how young women in cities were drawn into immoral behavior, how they became corrupted by independence and exposure to worldly influences. The sisters had determined that such women required strict rehabilitation through isolation, discipline, and what Adelaide termed correction. She described their selection process in detail, explaining that they sought women who had weak family connections, transient lifestyles, and character flaws that Adelaide believed indicated moral corruption. Women who wrote frequently to families, who maintained steady employment, who attended church regularly, these were not suitable subjects. But young women who seemed adrift, who had severed ties with relatives, who exhibited what Adelaide considered signs of moral weakness, these were the ones chosen for the special treatment the attic provided. Adelaide's description of the process by which women were moved to the attic was chillingly methodical. She explained that she would drug victims' food with laudanum or chloroform-laced drinks, waiting until the woman was unconscious before she and Constance would carry the body to the attic. The victim would awaken in one of the cells, restrained and confused, where Adelaide would explain that she was now undergoing purification through isolation and correction. When Mansfield questioned Adelaide about the deaths that had occurred, she showed no remorse or even recognition that she had done anything criminal. She explained that some women were weak specimens who could not withstand the rigors of the treatment process. These deaths were unfortunate but necessary, she claimed, comparable to how a physician might lose a patient during difficult treatment. The most disturbing portion of Adelaide's confession concerned her sister Constance. Adelaide revealed that Constance had died by her own hand in November 1896, unable to continue participating in what Adelaide still referred to as their shared mission. Adelaide described finding Constance hanged in their bedroom. Rather than reporting this death, Adelaide had buried Constance secretly in the cellar and continued alone, maintaining the fiction that both sisters still operated Mortimer House. Following Adelaide's confession, authorities formed a special investigative committee to determine the full scope of crimes committed at Mortimer House and to identify as many victims as possible. The committee included Detective Inspector Mansfield, Medical Examiner Bradford, representatives from the District Attorney's Office, and consulting specialists in forensic identification. Their work, conducted throughout March and April of 1897, revealed a scale of horror even greater than initial assessments had suggested. The systematic excavation of the Mortimer property became a grim necessity. Investigators began in the cellar where Adelaide had indicated bodies were buried, carefully removing earth and debris to uncover human remains. The process was painstaking, requiring precise documentation of each discovery. Within the cellar, excavators found the remains of 5 individuals, including the body identified through personal effects as Constance Mortimer. The condition of Constance's remains, examined by Dr. Bradford, confirmed Adelaide's account that she had died by hanging approximately 4 months before the fire. The discovery of Constance's body in a crude grave, rather than properly interred, reinforced the depths of Adelaide's disturbed mental state. Additional excavations in the yard behind the house uncovered 3 more sets of remains buried at various depths, suggesting these burials had occurred at different times over several years. The backyard also yielded the remnants of Adelaide's incinerator, which, when carefully sifted, revealed bone fragments, teeth, and partially burned personal items. The forensic team determined that Adelaide had used fire as one method of destroying evidence, though the process had been incomplete. The final count of identified remains reached 23 individuals, though investigators acknowledged this number might not represent the complete total of Adelaide's victims. Some remains were too deteriorated or fragmentary to count as distinct individuals with certainty. The process of identification became a heartbreaking exercise in matching remains to missing persons reports, personal effects, and physical descriptions provided by families. Dental characteristics, unusual bone formations from old injuries, items of jewelry, and distinctive clothing all served as means of identification. Families who had spent years wondering about missing daughters learned the terrible truth. Harrison Moore's worst fears were confirmed when remains found in the attic were identified through Elizabeth's monogrammed locket and physical characteristics. The 3 women discovered alive in the attic, when firefighters had broken through the door, provided crucial eyewitness testimony about conditions and treatment within the cells. All 3 survivors were severely traumatized, malnourished, and suffering from various ailments resulting from their captivity. Their accounts corroborated Adelaide's confession while providing disturbing details about daily existence in the attic cells. The women described being fed minimal rations, often just bread and water, and being subjected to what Adelaide called treatments that included forced labor, religious indoctrination sessions where Adelaide would lecture them for hours about sin and redemption, and physical punishments for any perceived disobedience. Investigation into the sisters' financial records revealed unexplained income far exceeding what Mortimer House should have generated through legitimate lodging fees. Bank records showed regular deposits throughout the 1,890 seconds that could not be accounted for by known residents' payments. Cross-referencing these deposits with shipping records and Adelaide's confession led investigators to a disturbing revelation. Adelaide admitted that some women had not remained in the attic until death, but had instead been sold to brothels or labor camps in other states. As evidence mounted against Adelaide Mortimer and public outrage grew throughout Massachusetts, expectations focused on a criminal trial that would bring the accused to justice. However, the legal proceedings took an unexpected turn in May 1897, when a panel of 3 physicians examined Adelaide and unanimously declared her mentally incompetent to stand trial. The psychiatric evaluation, conducted over several days at Salem Hospital, concluded that she suffered from what was then termed advanced moral insanity with delusional episodes. The physicians noted her complete lack of remorse, her inability to comprehend that her actions constituted criminal wrongdoing, and her persistent belief that she had been engaged in righteous rehabilitation work. Under Massachusetts law, a defendant found incompetent to understand charges or assist in their own defense could not be tried in criminal court. On May 15, 1897, Adelaide Mortimer was committed to the Massachusetts State Lunatic Hospital at Worcester rather than being held for trial. This decision provoked immediate and intense public outrage. Families of victims organized petitions demanding that Adelaide face criminal prosecution regardless of her mental state. Newspaper editorials questioned whether claims of insanity were being used to shield a defendant from appropriate punishment. Legal scholars debated the limitations of contemporary insanity provisions and whether the law adequately addressed cases where defendants might be mentally disturbed yet fully aware of their actions. Despite public pressure, legal authorities maintained that proceeding with a trial would violate established precedents regarding defendants' mental competency. The district attorney explained that conviction would be virtually impossible if Adelaide could not participate in her own defense, and any verdict reached would likely be overturned on appeal. The decision to commit Adelaide to the asylum was presented as the only viable legal option. Adelaide's behavior at the Worcester Hospital reinforced the assessment of her profound mental disturbance. Staff members documented that she alternated between periods of complete catatonia, sitting motionless for hours, and episodes of violent agitation during which she would scream about completing her collection and saving the fallen women. Night staff reported that Adelaide frequently woke screaming. Her treating physicians noted that she showed no improvement despite various therapeutic interventions attempted at the time. Adelaide's death occurred on August 17, 1897, less than 6 months after the fire. The official cause listed in hospital records was complications from her burns combined with pneumonia, though the rapidity of her decline led to speculation about whether her death might have been self-inflicted or the result of refusing treatment. Hospital staff reported that Adelaide had been deteriorating for several weeks, refusing food and becoming increasingly unresponsive. No autopsy was performed, and she was buried quickly in an unmarked grave in the hospital cemetery with no family members or other mourners present. Simultaneously with Adelaide's commitment and death, a systematic effort began to seal official records pertaining to the case and erase public documentation of the crimes. This suppression was justified by authorities as necessary to protect the privacy and dignity of surviving victims. Court orders sealed investigative files, witness testimonies, and evidence inventories with the stipulation that they remain closed for 50 years. Property records for 47 Marlborough Street were removed from public archives. Most dramatically, newspaper archives were sanitized with articles about the case quietly removed from bound volumes. In the immediate aftermath of Adelaide's death and the official sealing of case records, the physical erasure of Mortimer House proceeded with remarkable speed. The property at 47 Marlborough Street was condemned by Salem authorities in September 1897. By November of that year, the entire structure had been demolished, the cellar filled with rubble, and the land cleared. The property was subdivided into smaller lots and sold to developers who constructed new buildings with no acknowledgement of the site's dark history. Within 2 years, commercial structures occupied the space where Mortimer House had stood, and no marker indicated what had occurred there. The surviving victims faced fates that reflected the limited understanding of trauma in the late 19th century. The 3 women rescued from the attic were initially treated for physical ailments, but their psychological suffering received minimal attention. 2 of the 3 survivors were eventually institutionalized in asylums, diagnosed with conditions ranging from hysteria to melancholia. The 3rd survivor was released to family who took her to another state where she lived under an assumed name, her connection to the Mortimer case hidden to protect her from social ostracism. For surviving victims and families of those who had perished, the silence imposed by official record sealing compounded the trauma. They were discouraged from speaking publicly about the case, told that such discussion would only bring shame. This enforced silence created intergenerational secrets, with many descendants learning the truth about their ancestors' fates only decades later, if at all. The sealed records remained closed until 1947, when the 50-year restriction period expired. Even then, the release of information was limited and controlled. Researchers who began examining the case in the late 1940s found that much documentation had been destroyed or lost. What emerged was a fragmentary picture that required extensive detective work to reconstruct. Academic interest in the Mortimer case developed gradually through the mid-20th century as scholars recognized its significance. The case offered insights into the psychology of female serial offenders, the social conditions that enabled systematic victimization of vulnerable women, and the mechanisms by which communities could ignore evidence of ongoing crimes. Modern investigation of the case accelerated in the 1990s and early 2000s. The discovery of Constance's journal in 2003, found during renovation of a Salem property, provided new insights. The journal revealed that Adelaide had dominated Constance since childhood, that the younger sister had been a victim of her elder's abuse long before they began victimizing others. Research into the sisters' background before Salem revealed that their Philadelphia origin story had been entirely fabricated. No records existed of Mortimer parents dying in that city. Investigators found suggestions that the sisters might have operated under different names in other locations, that their pattern might have begun years before they established themselves in Massachusetts. The current site of the former Mortimer house is occupied by a commercial building housing retail establishments and offices. Current tenants and property owners are largely unaware of the location's history. However, local legends persist. Stories circulate about sightings of women in attic windows of buildings that stand where Mortimer House once stood, though no such attic spaces exist in the modern structures. Night workers report occasional sounds of weeping or scratching that seem to come from above. The Mortimer case exemplifies how isolation combined with social prejudices, limited resources for investigating missing persons, and reluctance to interfere in private affairs created conditions allowing systematic predation to continue for years. The young women who disappeared into Adelaide's attic were failed by a society that did not value their lives as worthy of serious attention. The truth that was buried through official suppression refuses to remain entirely silent. The story continues to surface through historical research, through the occasional rediscovery of documents, and through persistent questions about how such horror could have remained hidden. For descendants of victims who have learned their ancestors' fates, the knowledge brings painful closure, but raises difficult questions about memory and justice. The final count of Adelaide Mortimer's victims will never be known with certainty. The 23 sets of remains identified in 1897 represent only those bodies that were recovered. Adelaide's confession suggested she had killed more, and her shipping records indicated that some captives had been sold rather than killed, their ultimate fates lost to history. What remains is a reminder that the most profound horrors often occur through systematic cruelty carried out over time, enabled by silence and society's willingness to look away.